Chapter 5. Egie Electronics Company Limited was now 5 years old and was beginning to make a profit after 3 difficult years of barely meeting its overheads. The company had moved to new premises on the Benin-Sapil Road where they hoped to have an assembly plant in the future if business continued to be good. Osifo, as the managing director, had worked really hard to get things going, and his partner and chairman, Mr. Ahmed, was pleased. So also was Mr. Wang, their major supplier. The company had branches in Yola, Kaduna, and Port Harcourt. Osifo was leading a fairly comfortable life now. He lived in a large company house in a good area, with a tennis court and a swimming pool. He had a driver, a cook, and a gardener. In short, he had everything befitting the chief executive of a moderately successful company. His family were fiercely proud of him. Life for his parents had at last become comfortable. There was no more tiresome farm work for them. Osifo and Ifani had converted the old house into a semi-modern one, and Chief Amerigo had fulfilled his election campaign promises to his constituency of pipe-borne water and electricity. Their greatest joy came when Osifo took them on a 3-week holiday to Europe and the USA. This had cost him a whole year's savings, and even then, his brothers and sisters had to contribute their share. But it had been well worth it, for it gave him great pleasure to watch the delight on his aged parents' faces as they marveled at almost everything they saw. 4 years afterwards, they kept their friends in the village spellbound with stories of the magic in the white man's cities. They were never tired of showing slides of their tour. The only dark cloud in their sky was Osifo's seemingly permanent state of bachelorhood. They could not understand why at 34 he still said that he had not met the right woman. Who was this right woman he was waiting for? At the rate he was going, they told him, they were unlikely to have grandchildren from him before they died. He laughed off their fears, saying that they had many more years to live, and that anyway they already had lots of grandchildren to surround themselves with. He was not short of girls, but while not actually changing them like ties, as he had promised himself years before when he had little time for them, he did have his fun and was happy, even though it was becoming increasingly embarrassing that there was no hostess at the parties they gave. Mr. Ahmed told him it gave the company a bad image if the managing director had no wife. People would think he was queer or something. What made the matter worse was that he had no children either. Once he overheard some girls discussing him at a party. "Oh, something is definitely wrong with Mr. Egie," said one. "At his age he's never been married. It's strange." "Yes, it is. It will be tough for whoever marries him." "Why?" "He must be set in his bachelor habits now and he will find it difficult to adjust to married life." "That's true, especially if he's not virile." "Yes, what a pity." Osifo smiled slowly. Not virile indeed. But he was not going to let what people think push him into getting married, he said to himself stubbornly. He wanted a twin soul like that which Wale had found in Yemasi. He did have a fairly steady relationship with Ito Hon, a veterinary surgeon with the Ministry of Agriculture. She was a pretty, sophisticated girl of about 25 and he was quite fond of her, to which was the closest he had been to being in love with any woman. Several times, he had been on the point of proposing to her, but he always held back. He felt there wasn't sufficient affection between them to sustain a marriage, and yet he couldn't stop seeing her. Sometimes he wondered if he wouldn't do well to marry her and start a family. At the back of his mind his rejection by Madam Adani still rankled, although only faintly now. Did he really have to be in love with the woman he married? What would happen when there was no more love between them? Was it not better to avoid the heart being involved? That way there would be no heartache. He wasn't sure that as part of the expansion and development of the company, Osifo had gone on a 9-month management course to Europe and the Far East. Now he was back and was itching to get on with the job. He went to work very fresh and eager to absorb everything. Things had run fairly smoothly in his absence and Mr. Shilen, the area manager for Kaduna who had deputized for him, had performed his duties satisfactorily. All the same, Osifo regarded the company as his baby and so was anxious to take over the reins once more. It wouldn't do to let people think I'm dispensable here, he told himself. The first week was pretty hectic as he struggled to get a grasp of everything that had been omitted from the regular monthly report he had received during his stay abroad. It was amazing how many important things were termed as trivial and left out of reports. For example, it was mentioned briefly that a new accountant/administration manager had been appointed to take the place of the previous one who had embezzled company money and had been asked to resign his appointment. But no names were given. He was really astonished when the personnel manager, Mr. Idahosa, introduced a woman to him as the new accountant/administration manager. His managers knew very well his sentiments about having to work closely with female staff. He just couldn't cope with it. In fact, after a succession of female secretaries, he had opted for a male one, and things had run smoothly ever since. No more off days every month and unexplained absences or long personal conversations on the telephone. The work was done. He wanted absolutely no one, and certainly not a female, messing up a company he had carefully built up. He didn't mind women in top positions so long as he didn't have to work too closely with them. Let their attitude to work be someone else's headache. In his company, he had always worked very closely with the accountant, and he had had a very good working relationship with Mr. Otabo, the previous one. Although the man was a cheat, he had worked conscientiously otherwise, and that was why for many months Osifo had overlooked his malpractices and only given him verbal warnings. When Osifo was introduced to the lady, he hid his surprise well, spoke pleasantly to her and welcomed her into the company, but as soon as she left the room, he gave full vent to his annoyance. "Now, what did you do such a thing for?" he asked Mr. Shillen and Mr. Idahosa. "You never mentioned it in the report." "What, Mr. Egie?" asked Mr. Shillen. "Employ a lady as an accountant here. You know full well I cannot work closely with women, and also that I have to work quite closely with anyone in that particular position. I regularly need to see the accountant at short notice, whether in the office or at home, and often we have to work late together. How do you expect me to have such a working relationship with a lady? Ridiculous." "I'm sorry, Mr. Egie," said Mr. Shillen. "I accept full responsibility for the appointment. You see, she is highly qualified for the job, and she was the best of the lot we interviewed. She had excellent references from the branch of the bank with which she worked in Lagos. Besides, I've had no problem with her in the 6 months she's been here. She works hard, and things have improved in the accounts and the administration departments," put in Mr. Idahosa. "I don't care. Sack her. I don't want a female accountant. It will be too much trouble. Imagine this, I'll have to knock on the door each time I want to go into her office. I'll have to watch my language when things aren't going too well so as not to reduce her to tears. I'll have to put up with numerous excuses for late coming and absences. Of course, she cannot work late or at weekends because of her husband and the children. How do we get any work done? Ridiculous. She'd not married," said Mr. Idahosa, "or rather, she's divorced with no children. She works late sometimes, but I don't think she needs to, as her work is always up to date." "She divorced," you said. "That's even worse," the frustrated female. "She'll spend hours on end on the telephone, calling up one boyfriend after the other, or plainly gossiping with others like herself. I might tolerate that from a typist or a clerk, but certainly not from an accountant." "Has she been confirmed yet?" "No. She has 3 more months to go." "No problem then. Simply don't confirm her appointment. Get rid of her on some pretext or other. That will be difficult now that she's been written a letter saying we're satisfied with her work and that the second part of her probation has begun." "Who wrote that?" "I did," said Mr. Idahosa. "It's routine. Let's hope she'll embezzle some company money as her predecessor did and she'll get the sack." "I doubt if Miss Amerigo will do that," put in Mr. Shillen. "What will she need the money for? She has only herself to look after. Besides, I think she's honest. So was her predecessor until 2 years ago when he started building a new house. He had been a conscientious worker until then and I rather liked him. Do tell me. Is this Miss Amengo any relation of Chief Amengo the lawyer? I don't know, said Mr. Shillen, but I understand her father is a member of the National Assembly. Then she's Chief Amengo's daughter. Wait a minute. Is her first name Ndidi? Yes. Do you know the family? Yes, I know Chief Amengo, although I've not seen him for some time, and I've met Ndidi once. So, that was Miss Hotitoyati. When I last saw her, she was all legs and pimples. Quite haughty and insolent she was too. Well, don't let that count against her now. She's a fine lady. I see that you like her. I do. I think she's an asset to the company. She works very hard and is quite reliable. You'll enjoy working with her since you like to work hard too. I doubt if I'll enjoy working with her, but I'll give her a chance since she has such glowing recommendations from you both. Osifo tried as hard as he could to find flaws in Ndidi's work, but he could not. She carried out her duties efficiently and worked late when asked to. Her only fault was that she was perhaps too strict with the workers, but then he could not really complain about that. She had lowered the formerly high rate of absenteeism since she took over, and loafing about during office hours had almost stopped. Sometimes he wondered if she was really as hard as she made out. Perhaps the staff did need an iron hand in order to be made to sit up. However, he still did not think a woman was right for the position, and the fact that she was Chief Amengo's daughter did not help matters. He had not forgotten the way the chief treated his workers. His mother's cousin who worked at the factory in youth said that conditions were still bad there. Although the factory had expanded and was making a profit, the workers were still among the lowest paid in the country, and whenever they asked for better conditions of service, the chief would threaten to shut down the factory. The people could hardly afford this since there was high unemployment in the area. To them, half a loaf was better than no loaf at all. Osifo also resented the way the chief had cast aside his father, who had helped him immensely during his first election campaign. Not only did the chief fail to show appreciation for his friend's help, but having established a foothold in that constituency, he ignored Mr. Egie and began to deal directly with the village heads and elders who had been introduced to him by his friend in the first place. He hardly saw his old friend anymore. Mr. Egie, on the other hand, was not offended by his friend's attitude. He was used to it. What pleased him was that he had given help satisfactorily when asked, and as far as he was concerned, that was all that mattered. Although he did not find her beautiful, certainly not in the fabulous way Itohon was, Osifo was not indifferent to Ndidi's charms. She was attractive, had a good figure, and carried herself well, and those long, long legs. She had charming manners to go with them too. She appealed to him more now than she did as a teenager. Sometimes, when they sat working together and their knees or hands met accidentally, a shiver would run through him. This annoyed him, as she never seemed to notice anything amiss. She never moved away nor took the slightest interest. He consoled himself by saying that he wouldn't be a man if sitting close to a pretty lady failed to stir up anything in him. But it was bad for work. He made it a point never to date any female in his establishment, as this might lead to the lady concerned becoming heady and uncooperative towards her immediate bosses. It wasn't worth it, however. Perhaps this would be the best way to rid the company of Ndidi, he sometimes said to himself. He would date her a few times and then drop her. She was the proud type who would certainly not like to remain in the farm after such a thing had happened to her. But did he really have to go to such lengths? The whole thing would be too untidy, yet something had to be done to put things right. Perhaps if he overworked her and she could not keep up with the pace, she would go of her own volition. Ndidi thought Osifo pompous and overbearing. Why was he constantly anxious to show everyone that he was the boss in the place? She had heard that he built up the farm from scratch, but surely he could afford to relax a bit now. There was certainly no threat to his position from any quarter. Was it all a sign of insecurity? She found him intelligent, conscientious, and full of confidence. All some bosses wanted to know from the accountant was how well or badly the company was doing financially, but Osifo wanted more than that, and no detail was too minor for him. He took all the intricacies of accountancy in his stride. She had no doubt that he could carry out the duties of an accountant well if the need arose. Later, she discovered that that was how he kept tabs on all the departments. He knew every employee by sight and name, and what his or her duties were. She enjoyed working with him but was uneasy about his veiled resentment of her. She had been told that he did not want her in the company because she was Chief Amengo's daughter. But her father had never mentioned him to her even though he knew where she worked. Perhaps he did not know who the managing director was. Osifo had told her that he once spent the night with her family and that they had gone out together to a disco session, but she could not recollect having seen him before. During her father's early days in politics, they had entertained a lot and had many guests to stay, and it was impossible to recall every face point. One thing she was quite sure of was that Osifo was deliberately overworking her in order to edge her out of the company. She could cope with the work all right, but what she could not stand was unreasonableness. For instance, she got to the office one morning to find an airline ticket and a note from him telling her to take the 10:30 a.m. flight to Kaduna for urgent business. But both of them had worked together late the previous evening and he had not breathed a word about the journey. When she checked, she found that the ticket had been purchased and the flight booked several days before. As head of the administration department, she was supposed to be in charge of travel. Her first reaction that morning was to say to hell with it all and stay put. She might have no family, but that did not mean that she had no right to a planned life. Even a man could not be ordered about like that at a moment's notice. It wasn't as if what was involved was an emergency which couldn't keep until the next working day, which was a Monday. The trip would ruin the weekend which she and Gogo had planned to spend in Lagos. He was going to arrive late that afternoon and they were going to take the last flight out to Lagos. Now, all that would have to be altered. Gogo would be so mad. He hated his plans being messed up by others. She did, too. She went to Kaduna anyway, after telling Gogo in a hurried note to proceed to Lagos and that she would take the first flight there from Kaduna the next day. At times, she thought she was altogether too eager to please Osifo. It was not as if she could not get another, and probably better paid, job elsewhere if she were to leave Egie Electronics. But why give the man the pleasure of seeing his plan work? If he wanted her out, then let him sack her. She would sue him for wrongful and malicious dismissal and sock him for tens of thousands of naira. She would fight him with every kobo she had. Why must she always be the one to give in? She had given in meekly to Seju when news of Bemi came. Instead of asserting herself and making lots of trouble for all concerned, she had merely accepted the situation and Seju had got off lightly, very lightly indeed, and she had been humiliated. She had thought then that she was reacting in a civilized manner. Not that she had had much choice in the matter, but at least she would have had the satisfaction that other people had had a headache too. Anyway, the present situation was a much easier one since neither love nor affection was involved. She was going to stay on and only leave the company when it suited her to do so. She knew exactly when that would be, for she had decided to get even with Osifo for all this pushing around. She would hit him when it would hurt him most. Meanwhile, her relationship with Gogo had moved a step forward. She had stopped seeing other men and she and Gogo were now going steady. Although she suspected that this was one-sided, for she had a feeling that he still had other women in Wari and Port Harcourt. This did not bother her, for after all the stalling was on her side. He proposed to her steadily every other month and it became a standing joke as she turned him down on each occasion. Although he appeared serious about his intention to marry her, she did not think he could go through with it if accepted. He probably proposed to her to serve his conscience and assure both of them that he was not wasting her time. She felt he was too independent and too set in his ways to want to give up his freedom a third time. He would someday perhaps, when he was older and needed someone to take care of him, but not just yet. Sometimes, she thought she should take the bull by the horns, accept him, and settle down. At 30, she felt she was not getting any younger. She knew that their marriage could be successful if she took things coolly and in a mature way. He was a very likable person with his ready humor and relaxed view of life, and besides, he was successful. Her parents, particularly her father, liked him and were always asking her to bring him over for a meal or drinks whenever they were both in Lagos. She smiled at the thought of her father. The old man had mellowed a lot since the arrival of a baby girl by his second wife, Egie, a 22-year-old girl he had married 2 years before. Whenever he came down to Benin City, he liked nothing better in his spare time than to dandle the baby on his knees and coo endlessly to her. If he was thrilled about her, Ndidi's mother was besotted. As soon as Egie became pregnant, she had gone to Europe on a shopping spree for both the mother-to-be and her child, and she took over control completely when the baby arrived, only allowing the mother to breastfeed her. Her devotion to both Egie and her child went deeper than just playing her role as senior wife, for she had actually chosen the bride for her husband from her own village, and she had paid the bride price. Egie called her Mama and took any problem she had to her. Ndidi was a sister and the boy's brother. Egie liked the family into which she had married and counted herself luckier than most of her friends. Not only was the family a wealthy one, but the senior wife was also kind. She had always known that she would marry Chief Amerigo for as long as she could remember. All her expenses had been paid for by Mrs. Amerigo. She had left college in her second year when she kept failing her examinations and had told her parents she did not want to study anymore, but Mrs. Amerigo had insisted she went to a catering school in Asaba. This she had done and had got married as soon as she had completed her studies. She lived in the Amerigo family house in Benin City with Ndidi's paternal grandmother and a host of cousins. Sometimes she would go and spend a week or two with Ndidi's parents, who now lived most of the time in Lagos. Egie tried her best to please the family. She went to Ndidi's flat every weekend to clean and cook. Ndidi, who liked her privacy, protested, but to no avail. The girl simply enjoyed doing things for Ndidi and her brothers. It was part of the culture in which she had been brought up, and to behave otherwise would have been strange. She in turn was well looked after by the family. She only had to express a wish and it was granted by one member or the other. All these things reminded Ndidi of what her father had told her in London about a woman being married to the whole family in the African context. It was true, although she doubted if she would be able to comply. It would be too much trouble, for not all families were nice or appreciative of such a service. Even though she was not yet married to Gogo, some of his relations had sometimes asked her to help out at family parties in Warri, and she had hated every minute of it. She did not mind the work, but usually at these all-female gatherings, wives were always given all the heavy duties while the daughters of the family sat around all day giving orders, chatting, eating, and doing very little work. It made her feel like an unpaid servant. If a member of the family disliked you, you'd had it, for the occasion provided an opportunity for her to say jokingly aloud what she thought of you. You would be too embarrassed to answer back. Osifo and Itohon were having a drink in his club one afternoon when Ndidi and Gogo came in. They were in tennis gear and were in the company of Remy Hardman, a fellow member. Although he had seen them together before, Osifo felt slightly annoyed on seeing Ndidi and Gogo arm in arm. I don't know what the fuss is all about. The man is a dandy and ought to be displayed in a glass case, he said under his breath, eyeing Gogo's embroidered sports shirt with distaste. Asked Itohon, looking up from stirring her drink. Did you speak? Just thinking aloud. She saw Ndidi. Oh, here comes your accountant and her glamorous boyfriend or fiancé. Which is he? Are they engaged? I don't know, he said, getting angry. I know nothing about her private life. Ndidi saw them and waved, then she whispered to Gogo, and they walked over. She introduced both men and went over to Itohon for a little chat. Gogo towered above Osifo and spoke to him in a condescending manner. It reminded Osifo of Uncle Abayaden of Madam Adani days. However, he had built up a lot of confidence in himself since then, and such an attitude no longer worried him, so he merely smiled when Gogo said he was pleased to meet Ndidi's big white chief at last. They looked at each other with barely concealed dislike. That's a nice shirt you have on, remarked Osifo. Oh, thanks. You can't buy anything like it here. I had it made especially for me by a tailor in Hamburg. Oh, I wouldn't want to buy it. It looks rather feminine. Some jester might even say you've got your wife's blouse on, but I must say it looks wonderful on you. I've got the figure to carry it off, said Gogo with pride. Precisely what I thought. On some men it will look sissy, but then, said Osifo sweetly. He sat down and picked up his drink. What do you mean? Asked the other. In what way? Just then the girls finished their chat and the couple moved off, with Gogo throwing a look of daggers at the unperturbed Osifo. What was that for? Asked Itohan. He looked as if he could cheerfully murder you. What did you say to him? I told him his shirt was nice. It seemed to make him angry. That's strange. Perhaps you should have offered them a drink. Why? They are not my guests. They are Remy's. Come on, let's drink up and go. Ndidi was confirmed in her position and things continued in very much the same way. Osifo still hadn't quite shelved his plan to replace her with a male accountant, only now there was no urgency. He had decided that when he got the right man, he would make him financial controller and Ndidi would have to report to him. If she did not like the new setup, then she was free to withdraw her services. It would be a pity if she decided to go, for he now agreed with Mr. Schillen and Mr. Idahosa that she was an asset to the company. She was one of the few managers that he could trust with money and confidential matters, and in certain things he trusted only her and relied on her sense of judgment. He was amused when he was told by a colleague that some members of staff referred to her as Mr. Egie's backbone. Backbone indeed. Did he really rely on her that much? He knew that if he wanted things done the way he would have done them himself, then he could entrust them to her only. She had never disappointed him. She was cooperative and was eager to please him the way things were between herself and Osifo pleased Ndidi. She was pandering to most of his demands, and he seemed to like it. She never grumbled when he gave her responsibilities outside her normal duties or suggested outrageous working hours. What satisfied her most was the confidence and trust he had in her. He doesn't realize it yet, she confided in Nimi, her bosom friend, but he's beginning to rely on me more and more to carry out important assignments for him. What's wrong with that? You told me you enjoy working for him. That's right, I do, but it's unwise of him to have so much trust in me. Why? I might betray him or let him down. Well, would you? I don't know. You see, it will be nice to hurt him for all these knocks I've been getting from him. He should realize I'm not a slave. He's selfish. He's after the interest of his wretched company all the time. He never bothers to find out whether it is convenient or not for me to work late or travel at a moment's notice. He just gives the orders. But surely, Ndidi, he wouldn't go as far as betraying the trust he has in you in order to make him know that you don't like the way he treats you. I might. That's why I've worked hard all these months to make him trust me. That sounds hard and calculating and unlike you. Well, that was the plan I had in mind when I realized that he didn't want me in the company. Now, I'm not so sure. Tell me, why do you let him treat you as he does? You're normally a no-nonsense person. I overheard Gogo telling Martin the other day that he was getting fed up with the whole thing. He said that before you both plan an outing, you've got to make sure first that Mr. Egie did not require your services for that period. Is it true? Have things got as bad as that? No, they haven't, laughed Ndidi. Gogo was only exaggerating as usual. He dislikes Osifo. Who's Osifo? Mr. Egie. Oh, you're on first name terms, are you? No. Only in my thoughts. Come on, Enimi, out with it. What are you suggesting? Nothing. You watch out, my girl, she said, wagging a finger. You've probably fallen in love with him without realizing it. Ndidi couldn't help bursting into laughter. Now, you've really said it, Nimi. Fall in love with him indeed. You're kidding. The man is unbearable and insensitive. Who would fall in love with a brick wall? He has girlfriends. Sure, he does, but do they love him? Look at that piece of nuisance he goes about with. Itohan, or whatever her name is, the doctor of damn animals. She's only after his money and position if you ask me. I don't think so. She has a good job and comes from a fairly rich family. She doesn't need his money. She must love him. How can she love him? To love a man like Osifo, you need a lot of patience and understanding to break through the defense he's built up all around him, and Itohan looks pretty shallow to me, not the type to bother to study a man. She can't love him deeply, that's if she does love him at all. She'd wasting her time too. He doesn't love her. How do you know that? Does he discuss her with you? No. I knew by intuition. You must be in love with him then. I've never heard you speak so strongly against another woman. Do you dislike Itohan? Not really, but I don't like the way she hangs around him. She should stick to her damn friends. Why? Well, never mind. But look out, as I said. I can see the love light in your eyes. Ho! Ho! It's for Gogo and no one else.